The landing at Anzac Cove on Sunday, 25 April 1915, also known as the landing at Gaba Tepe, and to the Turks as the Arab-Urnu battle, was part of the amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula by the forces of the British Empire, which began the land phase of the Gallipoli campaign of the First World War. The assault troops, mostly from the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, landed at night on the western side of the peninsula. They were put ashore 1 mile north of their intended landing beach. In the darkness, the assault formations became mixed up, but the troops gradually made their way inland, under increasing opposition from the Ottoman Turkish defenders. Not long after coming ashore, the Anzac plans were discarded, and the companies and battalions were thrown into battle piecemeal, and received mixed orders. Some advanced to their pre-designated objectives while others were diverted to other areas, then ordered to dig in along defensive ridge lines. Although they failed to achieve their objectives, by nightfall the Anzacs had formed a beachhead, albeit much smaller than intended. In places they were clinging onto cliff faces with no organized defense system. Their precarious position convinced both divisional commanders to ask for an evacuation. But after taking advice from the Royal Navy about how practicable that would be, the Army commander decided they would stay. The exact number of the day's casualties is not known. The Anzacs had landed 2 divisions, but over 2,000 of their men had been killed or wounded, together with at least a similar number of Turkish casualties. Since 1916, the anniversary of the landings on the 25th of April has been commemorated as Anzac Day, becoming one of the most important national celebrations in Australia and New Zealand. The anniversary is also commemorated in Turkey, the United Kingdom and Ireland. Background: the Ottoman Turkish Empire entered the First World War on the side of the Central Powers on 31 October 1914. The stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front convinced the British Imperial War Cabinet that an attack on the Central Powers elsewhere, particularly Turkey, could be the best way of winning the war. From February 1915, this took the form of naval operations aimed at forcing a passage through the Dardanelles. But after several setbacks, it was decided that a land campaign was also necessary. To that end, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force was formed under the command of General Ian Hamilton. 3 amphibious landings were planned to secure the Gallipoli Peninsula, which would allow the Navy to attack the Turkish capital Constantinople, in the hope that would convince the Turks to ask for an armistice. Intention: Lieutenant General William Birdwood, commanding the inexperienced Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, comprising the Australian Division and 2 brigades of the New Zealand and Australian Division, was ordered to conduct an amphibious assault on the western side of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The New Zealand and Australian Division normally also had 2 mounted brigades assigned to it, but these had been left in Egypt, as it was believed there would be no requirement or opportunities to use mounted troops on the peninsula. To bring the division up to strength, Hamilton had tried unsuccessfully to get a brigade of Gurkhas attached to them. In total, Anzac strength was 30,638 men. The location chosen for the operation was between the headland of Gaba Tepe and the Fisherman's Hut, 3 miles to the north. Landing at dawn after a naval gunfire bombardment, the first troops were to seize the lower crests and southern spurs of Hill 971. The second wave would pass them to capture the spur of Hill 971, especially Maltepe. There they would be positioned to cut the enemy's lines of communications to the Kilid Bar Plateau, thus preventing the Turks from bringing reinforcements from the north to the Kilid Bar Plateau during the attack by the British 29th Division, which would advance from a separate beachhead further southwest. The capture of Maltepe was more vital and valuable than the capture of the Kilid Bar Plateau itself. Birdwood planned to arrive off the peninsula after the moon had set. with the first troops landing at 3:30, an hour before dawn. He declined the offer of an old merchant ship, loaded with troops, being deliberately grounded at Garbatipa. Instead, the troops were to travel in naval and merchant ships, transferring to rowing boats towed by small steamboats to make the assault. First to shore would be the Australian Division, commanded by Major General William Bridges. The 3rd Australian Brigade, known as the Covering Force, were to capture the 3rd Ridge from Battleship Hill south along the Seri Bear mountain range to Garbatipa. The 2nd Australian Brigade, landing next, were to capture all the Seri Bar range up to Hill 971 on the left. The 26th Jacobs Mountain Battery from the British Indian Army would land next, and then the 1st Australian Brigade, the division's reserve. All were to be ashore by 8:30. The New Zealand and Australian Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Godley, followed them. The 1st New Zealand Brigade, then the 4th Australian Brigade. Only after the 2nd Division had landed would the advance to Maltepe begin. The planners had come to the conclusion that the area was sparsely, if at all, defended, and that they should be able to achieve their objectives with no problems. Turkish opposition had not been considered. Turkish forces. The First World War Ottoman Turkish Army was modeled after the German Imperial Army, with most of its members being conscripted for 2 years or 3 years. They then served in the reserve for the next 23 years. The pre-war army had 208,000 men in 36 divisions, formed into Army Corps and field armies. On mobilization, each division had 3 infantry and 1 artillery regiment for a total of around 10,000 men, or about half the size of the equivalent British formation. Unlike the largely inexperienced Anzacs, all the Turkish army commanders, down to company commander level, were very experienced, being veterans of the Italo-Turkish and Balkan Wars. The British preparations could not be made in secret, and by March 1915, the Turks were aware that a force of 50,000 British and 30,000 French troops was gathering at Lemnos. They considered there were only 4 likely places for them to land: Cape Helles, Garbatipa, Bulair, or on the Asiatic coast of the Dardanelles. On the 24th of March, the Turks formed the Fifth Army, a force of over 100,000 men, in 2 corps of 6 divisions and a cavalry brigade, commanded by the German General Otto Liman von Sanders. The Fifth Army deployed the 3rd Corps at Gallipoli and the 15th Corps on the Asiatic coast. The 5th Division and a cavalry brigade were on the European mainland, positioned to support the 3rd Corps if required. The 3rd Corps had the 9th Division, the 19th Division and the 7th Division. The 9th Division provided coastal defense from Cape Helles north to Bulair, where the 7th Division took over, while the 19th Division at Midos was the Corps Reserve. The area around Garbatipa, where the Anzac landings would take place, was defended by a battalion of the 27th Infantry Regiment. Anzac Cove. On the 19th of April, orders were issued for the Anzacs to stop training, and for all ships and small boats to take on coal and stores, in preparation for a landing originally scheduled to occur on the 23rd of April. Weather conditions delayed their departure from Lemnos until dawn on the 24th of April. The Royal Navy battleships Queen, Triumph, Prince of Wales, London, and Majestic, the cruiser Bacchante, 7 destroyers and 4 transport ships led the way, carrying the 3rd Brigade. They were followed by the rest of the force, who were embarked in their own transport ships. First 6 companies at 100. On the 25th of April, the British ships stopped at sea, and 36 rowing boats towed by 12 steamers embarked the first 6 companies, 2 each from the 9th, 10th and 11th battalions. At 200, a Turkish sentry reported seeing ships moving at sea, and at 2:30 the report was sent to 9th Division's headquarters. At 2:53 the ships headed towards the peninsula, continuing until 3:30 when the larger ships stopped. With 50 yards to go, the rowing boats continued using only their oars. Around 4:30 Turkish sentries opened fire on the boats, but the first Anzac troops were already ashore at Beach Z, called Ari Burnu at the time, but later known as Anzac Cove. They were 1 mile further north than intended, and instead of an open beach they were faced with steep cliffs and ridges up to or around 300 feet in height. However, the mistake had put them ashore at a relatively undefended area, at Garba Tepe further south where they had planned to land. There was a strong point, with an artillery battery close by equipped with two 15 cm and two 12 cm guns, and the 5th Company, 27th Infantry Regiment was positioned to counter-attack any landing at that more southern point. The hills surrounding the cove where the Anzacs landed made the beach safe from direct-fire Turkish artillery. 15 minutes after the landing, the Royal Navy began firing at targets in the hills. On their way in, the rowing boats had become mixed up. The 11th Battalion grounded to the north of Ari Burnu Point, while the 9th Battalion hit the point or just south of it, together with most of the 10th Battalion. The plan was for them to cross the open ground and assault the first ridge line, but they were faced with a hill that came down almost to the water line, and there was confusion while the officers tried to work out their location. Under small arms fire from the 4th Company, 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, who had a platoon of between 80 and 90 men at Anzac Cove and a 2nd platoon in the north around the fisherman's hut. The 3rd platoon was in a reserve position on the 2nd ridge. They also manned the Garba Tepe strong point, equipped with two obsolescent multi-barreled Nordenfeldt machine guns, and several smaller posts in the south. Men from the 9th and 10th Battalions started up the Ari Burnu slope, grabbing the gorse branches or digging their bayonets into the soil to provide leverage. At the peak they found an abandoned trench, the Turks having withdrawn inland. Soon the Australians reached Pluggers Plateau, the edge of which was defended by a trench. But the Turks had withdrawn to the next summit 200 yards inland, from where they fired at the Australians coming onto the plateau. As they arrived, Major Edmund Brockman of the 11th Battalion started sorting out the mess, sending the 9th Battalion's men to the right flank, the 11th Battalion's to the left, and keeping the 10th Battalion in the center. 2nd 6 Companies. The 2nd 6 Companies landed while it was still dark, the destroyers coming to within 500 yards to disembark the troops, under fire. They also landed at Anzac Cove, but now as planned the 11th were in the north, 10th in the center and the 9th in the south. The 12th Battalion landed all along the beach. This extended the beachhead 500 yards to the north of Ari Burnu, and 1.5 miles to the south. Landing under fire, some of the assaulting troops were killed in their boats, and others as they reached the beach. Once ashore they headed inland. In the south, the first men from the 9th and 12th Battalions reached the bottom of 400 Plateau. In the north, the first men from the 11th and 12th Battalions started up Walker's Ridge, under fire from a nearby Turkish trench. Around the same time Turkish artillery started bombarding the beachhead, destroying at least 6 boats. The Australians fought their way forward and reached Russell's Top. The Turks withdrew through the neck to Baby 700, 350 yards away. Coming under fire again, the Australians went aground, having advanced only around 1,000 yards inland. Some also dug in at the neck, a 20 yards piece of high ground between Malone's Gully to the north and Monash Valley to the south. Around this time Colonel Ewan Sinclair McLagan, commanding the 3rd Brigade, decided to change the corps plan. Concerned about a possible counter-attack from the south, he decided to hold the 2nd Ridge instead of pushing forward to the 3rd or Gun Ridge. This hesitation suited the Turkish defense plans, which required the forward troops to gain time for the reserves to coordinate a counter-attack. Turkish reaction at 5:45. Lieutenant Colonel Mehmet Şefik of the Turkish 27th Infantry Regiment received orders to move his 1st and 3rd Battalions to the west and support the 2nd Battalion around Garbatipa. The two battalions were already assembled, having spent that night carrying out military exercises. They could not be sent to Arıburnu as it was not marked on the Turkish maps. Colonel Halil Sami, commanding the 9th Division, also ordered the division's machine gun company and an artillery battery to move in support of the 27th Infantry Regiment, followed soon after by an 77mm artillery battery. At 800, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, commanding the 19th Division, was ordered to send a battalion to support them. Kemal instead decided to go himself with the 57th Infantry Regiment and an artillery battery towards Çanakkale, which he realized was the key point in the defense. Whoever held those heights would dominate the battlefield. By chance, the 57th Infantry were supposed to have been on an exercise that morning around Hill 971 and had been prepared since 5:30, waiting for orders. At 900, Şefik and his two battalions were approaching Kavaktepe, and made contact with his 2nd Battalion that had conducted a fighting withdrawal, and an hour and a half later the regiment was deployed to stop the Anzacs advancing any further. Around 1000, Kemal arrived at Scrubby Knoll and steadied some retreating troops, pushing him back into a defensive position. As they arrived, the 57th Infantry Regiment were given their orders and prepared to counter-attack. Scrubby Knoll, known to the Turks as Kemaliera, now became the site of the Turkish headquarters for the remainder of the campaign.